We're standing here on the corner of Wall and Water Street, area of the East River docks in the 18th century. Behind me over here is where the Tontine coffee house was. Over across the street is where the Merchant's Coffee House was. So this was a very bustling area with lots of different kinds of people that really highlighted the social structure of New York in the 18th century. All different kinds of people would have crossed paths here. You would have had the elite merchant class who had their counting houses around here and who would gather at coffee houses like the Tontine or at the Merchant's Coffee House to transact business. Remember, there's not a lot of big spaces to gather. People didn't necessarily have people over in their homes. They had people, they didn't have people over to their offices, so they actually would transact business in these semi-public spaces. And that's really why the merchants established these coffee houses like the Tontine and the Merchant's Coffee House in order to transact business. And also they could see right out the windows of these coffee houses the ships coming in from the West Indies and from Europe. You also would have had artisans who worked around here. Actually, Hercules Mulligan, who was Hamilton's friend, featured in the musical, had his tailor shop here on Water Street. You also had lots of artisans who worked in the shipping trades. The shipyards were just up to the north here, going up to Corlear's Hook. So you would have had rope makers and ship's chandlers and coopers and ship makers and all the people who were involved in the shipping trades. And you also had day laborers who were working along the docks unloading ships, and you had indentured servants, you had free laborers, you also had a very significant enslaved population in New York City. About 15% of New Yorkers in the mid-18th century were enslaved. And in fact, just behind me was what was known as the meal market in the 18th century, the mid-18th century, which was so called because that's where cereals were sold, grains, and other goods like that. But it also was New York's slave market. The slave ships would disembark right here on the corner of Water and Wall. And then you had a slave market that was set up here for a very long period of time and dismantled in the 1750s. Slavery doesn't end in New York, of course, until 1827, and it is a very significant piece of New York City's 18th century social structure. Unlike the plantation slaves of Virginia, enslaved people in New York would have worked on the docks. Men would have worked on the docks. Women would have worked in domestic service. There was a lot of movement about the city for enslaved persons, more so than you would have found in plantation areas, and also a lot of concern about insurrection, about slave gatherings. And so every now and then the city would crack down on those kinds of activities, either because of a perceived or actual slave plot or slave conspiracy to overthrow their masters. A big one happened in 1712, another one happened in 1741, and they would be followed by very serious crackdowns on the mobility and activity of enslaved persons in New York. Many of the merchants who would have been spending time at these coffee houses held slaves themselves. And so a lot of shoulder rubbing would happen around here, a lot of different groups of people coming together at the docks. New York was not a place where people could segregate themselves into neighborhoods because it was still a walking city in the 18th century. There wasn't public transportation, there was no subway, and so people really needed to live very close to where they worked, and so there was a lot of interaction. At the same time, especially beginning in the 1750s, or really taking off in the 1750s, you had a lot of efforts, especially among the elite, to really separate themselves off in terms of behaviors and also in terms of institutions, to set themselves off as refined, as genteel, and as separate from what they viewed as the lesser classes. And the coffee houses here were part of that. These were not working class taverns or artisan taverns. These were really elite institutions. They were remarkable for the kinds of interiors that they had, and for the higher quality of the food that they served, and for the more refined drinks, and also the more refined behaviors that would take place inside. One other thing I want to say here is that the Merchants Coffee House, which was across the street, was a really important space in terms of the development of the revolution. The Tontine Coffee House wasn't here yet, but the Merchants Coffee House was a place where the Sons of Liberty gathered. It was a place where some of the revolutionary activities were really planned on the part of the patriots. And it also was a place after the American Revolution where a lot of the very important financial institutions of New York and the United States were established, including the Chamber of Commerce, including the Bank of New York, which was, of course, Hamilton's bank, and also including the New York Stock Exchange, which was established actually across the street at the Tontine Coffee House. There was a tree, a buttonwood tree, and a group of traders, after the American Revolution, a group of traders got together and agreed to trade the federal bonds, which we're going to talk about at another spot, agreed to trade the federal bonds only with each other. So this was the beginning of the stock exchange. This was the first agreement among stockbrokers to trade with each other at a fixed rate of interest. And they signed that agreement. They called it the Buttonwood Agreement. It was signed by the Buttonwood tree. And that was really the very beginnings, the very early roots of the New York Stock Exchange.